Just as David Cameron's trying to make friends in Europe, he's losing them back at home. Soon after the Prime Minister waved a friendly goodbye to world leaders in Germany, he faced an angry row about his plan for a referendum on the EU. This morning's headlines were clear and unanimous. Ministers who want Britain to get out of the EU would have to quit or be sacked first. But today the Prime Minister insisted he'd not been saying that at all. He'd just been demanding support for his efforts to renegotiate Britain's relationship with Europe.
I feel that there was a misinterpretation, which is why I woke up and read the newspapers and thought, well, I will repeat what I said and make that very clear.
He was, he said, merely demanding that ministers back his efforts to get a better deal in Europe. But what was he saying about the referendum? He chose his words very, very carefully, repeatedly looking down to read from his notes.
I've always said what I want is an outcome for Britain that keeps us in a reformed EU. But I've also said we don't know the outcome of these negotiations, which is why I've always said I rule nothing out. Therefore, it would be wrong to answer hypothetical questions.
Journalists who wrote their stories after a briefing by the Prime Minister himself weren't convinced and didn't much like being told they'd got it wrong.
The view I want us to get to is a successful renegotiation, reform of the European Union, and being able to recommend that Britain should stay in the European Union. And of course, in that case, the government's not going to be a bystander. The government will have a very clear view.
It's not just noisy Tory backbenchers who are worried. Some in the cabinet who have to remain silent are concerned too. They want complete freedom to argue for Britain to leave the EU.
There's no argument whatsoever for trying to apply collective responsibility to people once they're faced with the decision, should we be inside Europe or outside Europe? Really as simple as that. It's the future of the country. Otherwise, you're going to get honourable, decent, intelligent people being forced to resign in order simply to be able to tell the truth.
If you're wondering what all the fuss is about, this is a debate about Britain's place in the world. It's about a vote that no one's had the chance to cast for more than 4 decades. But it's not just about geography, not just about politics, it's about history as well. Ever since Prime Minister Ted Heath signed Britain up to the European club, there's been a row about whether people knew what they were actually joining.
A new and a greater united Europe.
It was Labour's Harold Wilson who 40 years ago gave people a vote on whether to stay in. And he allowed ministers in his own cabinet to show their deep divisions on prime-time television.
Yeah. Well, will you please allow me to answer the question? No, if I may say so with respect, I don't think it's reasonable.
Years after Labour split on the issue, so too did the Tories. First under Margaret Thatcher, then John Major.
Like me or loathe me, don't bind my hands when I am negotiating on behalf of the British nation.
The Chancellor back then says there's no reason to think the Prime Minister can solve his party's European headache.
On the question of will this settle this once and for all, well, it'll settle it for a while. I wouldn't bet the House on this settling it forever. I think, these arguments will probably continue.
David Cameron insists that history doesn't need to repeat itself, and of course he may well be right, but Europe has long been a party splitter, and the relationship between Britain and the rest of the continent has been pretty tricky ever since those maps were produced. Nick Robinson, BBC News, Covent Garden.